the AUKUS agreement, the security pact, was to many people such a significant tectonic shift kind of thing in geopolitics. And so why don't I start by asking you, what is it that you see as the most significant implication of the AUKUS agreement or security pact? I would like to invite first our guest, Dr. STARKEVIČÜTÄ, to share with us just briefly, first, some impression of the AUKUS agreement, and then we'll go to Mr. Kim, and then finally we'll go to one of our own, Professor Ecology. Okay, great.
Okay, thank you so much for introduction. Do you hear me clearly? Okay.
Yes.
So in my opinion, that this agreement actually, the story of this agreement is closely related to Brexit. Because I always try to explain students it's very important to know history, a background of any trade or other agreement, a defense agreement, in order to understand the dynamics of the decisions. So it was used in Europe, in European Union, that Australia, New Zealand was covered by British members of the parliament, because due to history, due to Commonwealth, and so on. And the delegation always was led for many years by British members. So they gone from the parliament, and all those contacts, relations, somehow weakened substantially. And so far, European Union didn't find how to replace this long-term relations of British members of the European Parliament with Australia, New Zealand, and the region. Japan usually was, delegation for Japan usually was led by German members, and was a little bit more diverse from different countries. China is also was somehow led by German members, or because they have huge industry in the China. So it was also diversified. US delegation is in the interest of all member states. So it's quite diverse group of people. And only New Zealand or Australia was like more like British domain. And now it's gone. And British members, it seems to me, also took with them all contacts and everything. So it's naturally that in all fields, not only in defense, the contacts and trade relations moved from European Union closer to UK, because UK now is ready to establish on its own with own deals, own agreements. So my point of view that the whole thing happened due to this Brexit story and huge changes in European politics, which may be not seen from far away, but quite clearly seen from inside. As I'm talking about France, France is always more due to history. As I said, it's due to history. Due to history, has more closer relations with African countries. Some relations also with the, maybe, I don't know, China also a little bit, but China is mainly also interest of Italy due to production of some goods in China. So that's in Europe, it was clear. You covering that, I'm covering that, and then we exchange our views and have common solution. And now, as I said, this Australian still topic is still high on the agenda, who will take over and who has such a potential and such a knowledge as British members had to maintain relations with New Zealand and Australia.
This is fabulously interesting. Again, we wouldn't know this from outside, right? With Brexit also went the relationship between EU and Oceania in some sense, right? So that's fabulously interesting. Mr. Kim, would you like to share?
Okay, thank you. At first, thank you for your having me this conversation. I think the establishment of AUKUS is maybe it's a little bit early time to say, but I believe we are entering a kind of a new Cold War era, actually. Well, it's people, the AUKUS in Asia Pacific region already there exist many military alliance, for example, Korean, US-Korea alliance and Japan, US-Japan alliance or something like that. But also, as you know, there is a Quad. Quad is a strategic conversation among major 4 countries, so to speak, Japan, Australia, US, and also India. So even there is already many established, many organization is existing. All these, even though all these conditions, US and Australia definitely choose to establish a new military alliance. It means that such thing is not sufficient for guarantee some security in Asia Pacific region. But what is the purpose? It's just to contain China, as too evidently. So, well, it's I don't know, some confrontation between China and US is not so evident still, and also it's not some Cold. This confrontation is not so overwhelming as people still are. Anyway, this tendency is become much more aggravated, I think. So maybe the Asian Pacific region is already a little bit volatile region, but because of this creation of AUKUS, it will be much more volatile region become, I think. Yeah.
So Cold War instinct in part drives the emergence of the Security Pact. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Professor Koji.
It's difficult to summarize, I think, the dimensions of the submarine deal, but synoptically, there's a nexus of causation that's involved that one should keep in mind, it seems to me. The first one is simply geopolitical. The Chinese have, under Xi Jinping, decided that they want to have military parity with the United States, and they certainly want to dominate the security situation in the South China Sea, which China, as I think all of us know, has determined that that's the area of their sphere of influence. It's tantamount to their Monroe Doctrine. So that's one dimension. The second is the United States made a serious error, I believe, strategically, in cutting France out and therefore cutting Europe out of the determination coordinate between the United States and the Europeans and the Asiatic nations that are involved in one strategic setting to contain and address the Chinese expansion of power. If France, which has several million people, French in that area, plus 8,000 troops that are stationed there, they have a direct interest. And if the French have a direct interest, that means the Europeans have a direct interest. And the Biden administration essentially adopted a go-it-alone position, not too much different than the Trump administration, to in effect have two strategic settings, one for Europe, one for Asia, though as a matter of fact, the struggle between the United States, or generally the democratic states of both Asia, Europe, and more generally, is really a stark joining of what I call a struggle between free and authoritarian regimes as to which of those two forms of regimes are going to populate what is tantamount to a global struggle for this whole century. China right now clearly is an economic, almost an economic equal to the United States. Certainly its road and bridge initiative is far, in a way, more important than anything the Western states have in effect done to deal with the developing states. In short, the last element, which I believe encapsulates all these geopolitical and economic elements, is a struggle between tyrannical governments and liberal democratic governments. And the submarine deal is just one element in that long-term struggle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is great. This is so in some sense, the U.S. Announcing this initiative was in some sense a policy blunder, right? Upsetting, long-term allies like France. I do wonder to what extent this damage is long-lasting, and I'm wondering whether or not there have been efforts to repair this relationship between the United States and, France, our long-term ally. And so I think that leads pretty nicely to, some of the other questions I have in mind. I'm really curious how this security pact has been received over the past 2 months. It was announced in mid-September, and I'm wondering how this security pact was received, obviously by France, but other countries in Europe as well. Would you?
Yeah.
Let me pick up on the France one, because I've written 2 books on France. When the United States cut France out because they had lost the contract, let's be clear, for 12 diesel-powered submarines at a cost of approximately $66 billion, no small effort. When the United States undercut the French, they were essentially attacking the military-industrial complex of France. And that's just not simply a weapons production system. That is France's claim to be a global power. Between 2013 and 17, France sold advanced weapons to over 89 countries. When you attack the military-industrial complex of France, you are attacking the French state. So to call it clumsy was not clumsy. It was a deliberate action, and a deliberate action that I think damaged profoundly the relations between the United States and France, was largely, and again, our commentator from Europe can better answer this than I, because she's on station. I think reliability of the United States as a partner. And I am baffled, frankly, by that step, though the administration has made its announcement that it's going to cooperate. At the very time it was cooperating, it was undermining its relationship with its European partners.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. It's not just a policy blunder, it's a lot more than that, huh? It's deliberate.
No, the deliberate action. They're not dumb.
Yeah.
The French are certainly not taking the business that it was clumsy, as the president said. That's merely a rhetorical flourish to undercut a seriously damage to the U.S.-France, U.S.-European relationship. It'll be repaired, because where can the Europeans go but to the United States vis-a-vis Russia, okay? So that is why Macron certainly did make a big issue of it. But there's a long-term struggle to return back to some normality of mutual confidence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We'll get to that question later. I guess I'm forming in my head this question, Ed, that if it's such a deliberate policy, right? So it must mean that this policy was made, or this decision was made, to prioritize other key objectives of the US foreign policy, right? So we'll get to that point a little bit later. But first, I would like to hear how this security pact has been received by various parties in Europe.
Mr. Kim is the person that asked that one.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, I think it's a,
Would you, Dr. Stavrovichov?
Yes, sure. The issue is that European Union doesn't have own defense system or army and rely on NATO.
Right.
Only now, during the conference on future of Europe, ongoing conference, there is seriously discussed the possibility to have European Union army. So anyhow, our relations with the United States in defense through the NATO. And we usually say that this is NATO, which protect us, Lithuania in that example, from aggression from the other countries if it happens. A second point, I do not think that it's about Cold War. It's more like about digital economy and behaviors that came from social networks, aggressive behavior. Some countries started to behave very aggressively and just bully their neighbors. I'm not sure that they are going to attack, because in nowadays a war, or large-scale war, it was very, very expensive. So, and nobody has enough resources for such big operation. So usually they mix different provocations, hybrid measures, at least in Europe, to attack. So I see that deal about submarines, which will be in place after 20 years, as I understand. It takes some time to implement this. I see as Australian effort to look into the future, but it's not dealing with current problems. And I would like to ensure that France is not alone. And of course, in any case, all European Union member states will be behind France if France needs help or something. So that's not, but it's just natural happened. Britain went out and they are forming Anglo-Saxon alliance. Australia, New Zealand, Britain, United States. And we like continental Europe. It was before the Britain joined the European Union. So it's just two groups of countries, and now that's all defense, foreign policy, economic issues on the table to how to sort out. In most, I think that in a very peaceful manner. So in press there are some conflicts, some leakages, and the third point which I would like to highlight is that I always surprised a little bit by Australia and New Zealand policies. They tend to shut door, and that's all, like it happened with COVID. Australia and New Zealand just shut us out, and that it all went out. So they tend to look very inside, maybe because this remoteness of the region, and sometimes do not have contacts with China. They like, for them it's easy to just step back, but for other countries it's not so simple. That's the problem.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, Mr. Kim, you were going to jump into on this question. So I'm curious how you think about the reception of this in Europe, but also, you know, the reception of this security pact in Asia as well. Great.
Okay. At first, of course, the France had some kinds of a disappointment and embarrassment, something like that about this situation. But much more importantly, European countries had felt they are disregarded by American. because of this AUKUS. So, for example, if America really respected European partners, we can imagine some kinds of NATO plus Australia strategic dialogue format, something like that, instead of AUKUS. But Americans' choice as making new alliance, which is composed by completely different members. So in this situation, maybe European members will think more and more, even though they have some military alliance based on NATO, but they think they want to make relatively independent military power they want to establish for themselves. In fact, early this month, European Union announced that up to 2025, they will establish their own troop, which is not exist up to now. So this tendency is maybe strengthened with time. So definitely it will not show good signs to America also. But if there is some problem, European countries have not such much resources to build up military power. So definitely they will try to make some conversation and better relations with America also in near future. But anyway, currently they want to make some independent power. And also concerning the effect on Asian countries, well, of course, at first to China, the AUKUS is a relatively very explicit provocation to them. So, so they will maybe at first they will relying on some diplomatic way to contest about these things, but at the same time, China also try to build up military power, and at the same time strengthening some partnership with Russia, for example, and also make much more pressure on other countries around China, especially the countries who dispute the territorial issues with China, for example, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, something like these countries. So, well, the security condition will be worsened after this AUKUS. Well, I think in case of in case of the Japan, they also a little bit embarrassed by this situation, because Japan has already military alliance with America, and also Japan participated in Quad also, but all these pre-existing conditions, United States definitely choose to make a new military alliance. So I think Japan is actually worried about what's wrong, what is the real problem, the relations with America, they think. So they will try to find some way to develop or some way to contribute some, recover some relations with America. They will try, I think. But it is not also easy thing at all, because, for example, Japan can consider send their troops some dangerous reason, for example, but it is not easy based on their constitution, and also there's some sentiment in population. Generally, it's anti-war sentiment is very high there. So it's a very, very complicated situation. Anyway, Japan try to recover and make betterment their relations with America. I think in case of South Korea, is much more difficult situation, I think, actually. Well, currently, South Korean government is a relatively neutral position. They maintain a relatively neutral position between China and America. But creation of AUKUS could be a big pressure on Korean government also, because definitely South Korea also should choose one. they cannot maintain some ambiguous position forever. So it isn't absolutely not easy thing, but South Korea has already alliance with America, and also there is always a permanent threat by North Korea, something like that. So definitely, I believe it's a good solution to have good relations with America, but it depends on the government actually. And in fact, in South Korea next year, there is a presidential election, March 2022. There is two candidates. One is a relatively pro-Chinese candidate. Another one is a relatively pro-American candidate. As a government official, I cannot say which I prefer which candidate. But anyway, currently the pro-American candidate is relatively much more popular in South Korea. Yeah. Well, similar pressure will other countries also have a similar pressure. So many countries around China, I believe. Yeah.
This is fabulous. Thank you so much. It seems, I mean, the puzzles are building up in my mind at least. So, this policy, if it angered our ally France along with other European countries and, embarrassed Japan, it put pressure on other allies like South Korea, right? So despite all these, right, why is it? What's behind this policy, right? What does AUKUS tell us about the U.S. objectives and U.S. priorities, despite all these negative consequences, in some sense, from this AUKUS agreement? Why? What does the AUKUS treaty tell us about U.S. foreign policy?
It's telling us they don't know what they're doing. First of all, next month, the president will have an international or global Zoom for all the democracies. And his first statements at the security meeting at Munich in February, he contextualized the issue of facing the liberal democratic states in a way that I found very congenial, namely that it was eventually the problems we face is between a coalition of liberal democratic states, we'll just summarize it by freedom, versus states that are authoritarian. Alice Applebaum, article in The Atlantic this month, does a good job of indicating that the authoritarian states are not isolated. They're increasingly involved in cooperating to maintain the control of their populations. China is the largest exporter of surveillance equipment. They have over 600 million surveillance units now, and they want to double those so that every Chinese has an identifiable protocol. At the same time that the president, and I think correctly, states the context in which we all as humans live. Namely, we're so interdependent now. No individual state is capable of achieving its own security, its own welfare, or establishing its legitimacy. We have essentially a global society for the first time in the evolution of the human race, which means that's where the problem is who's going to decide the big questions of pandemics, climate change, trade, inequality, what regimes essentially will be established. And so the ANZUS Treaty is, to me, one shot across the bow towards this larger interdependent view. If the administration had continued on that larger framework established by the president in February, there would have been no way logically that the French and the Europeans would have been cut out of defining security relationships in Europe. But that's what I mean by they haven't got their act together. And one end, geopolitical, same old guys. Washington is, you need an analogy. Right now, it's like Versailles on stilts. with thousands of people whispering in the ear of each other. And the confusion in foreign policy is manifest. On one hand, they got the right idea, and then they cancel out the idea of an interdependent world, that we need liberal democracies to cooperate, not just in Europe with Europeans, Asian with Asians, but it's one strategic framework. We did it in World War II, but we've forgotten that essentially as humans, we're essentially connected in such a fashion that you can't disaggregate them into little parts any longer at a nation state level. If you do that, then you're condemned to some sort of geopolitical conflict and all the rest. And so my major point is the context of ANZUS is really the interdependence that we all now share as humans. And that's the struggle between authoritarian states, which increasingly are connecting with each other, and liberal democratic states that are in disrepair.
Mhm. Mhm. So just follow up on that, Professor Koji.
Oh, just
so-
call me Ed, please, please,
Ed,
please.
yes, and so what you're talking about is fascinating. So we have these global challenges, right? And in an interconnected world, but at the same time, we're also identifying sort of ideological confrontation, right, between liberal democracies and authoritarian governments. So what's your view on this? Do you think that this ideological confrontation is counterproductive to solve global challenges?
There's no, look at the major problem facing 7 billion, now 8 billion by 2050. There is no government in the foreseeable future. What government will be a default mode of the struggle between nation states within the global context? And if you go to that default mode, then the question turns on as to which regimes, open liberal democratic regimes or authoritarian regimes, are going to set the table for all the questions involved with economic welfare, geopolitical power, and legitimacy. The Chinese view right now, as you well know better than I, because you at least read Chinese and I don't, is that the liberal states are so divided against themselves because of liberal politics emphasizing interests over larger issues of commonality, and that the only states effectively that can meet the needs of their populations and therefore gain the legitimacy because they can meet those needs of welfare and geopolitical security are authoritarian states, namely China, clunk. And I think they've joined the issue, but we haven't caught up among the liberal democratic states, either domestically. Everyone needs, any casual look at American politics realizes that it's in a serious downward spiral with respect to its commitment to open societies. And certainly we haven't got our act together with means the liberal democratic states across one strategic playing field, if you will.
Right, yeah. So I did have a question I wanted to ask you, and I wonder, given the insight here, I will reframe this question. And so to the extent the AUKUS agreement or security pact is to contain China, well, let's just take that for a second. We don't always agree that necessarily this is a Cold War ramification, but just suppose to the extent that the AUKUS agreement is to contain China in Asia Pacific. So is such a policy to contain China going to be effective? Or in other words, can the US effectively contain China in Asia? And if, given the remarks in over the last couple of minutes, if indeed the West is divided and the administration doesn't know what it's doing, so is the US likely to be effective in containing China?
Well, I defer to my colleagues.
Yeah, Professor STARKEVIČÜÖTÄ.
Yes, I just want to say that Europe is keen to develop relations with all Asian region, not only with China. And therefore, European Union has signed trade agreements with Asian countries. Australia and New Zealand is ongoing, and thoroughly now with Vietnam, even countries which are, let's say, from different political system, just in an attempt to develop normal relations, economic relations that stabilize the world. And but on the other hand, European Union now started to develop strategic autonomy narrative, because after the COVID-19 became clear that some production is moved to China, to other countries, and when quarantine measures were in place, value chains became to fall. So it was necessary to think and to move production, or to rationalize production in Europe and in closer countries. China is trying to develop trade way from own country to Europe and to Western Europe with assistance of Britain, but they face a lot of problems. Their partner was Belarus, now in deep trouble. Partner in Russia is also not a lot of hurdles. So they do not have way to move their goods. Lithuania was a partner for the railway, but it was some arguments around the Taiwan situation. So it's not so easy for China to sell goods. So maybe US and China became more look for closer cooperation, because it's for China it's not so easy. So it's a win-win situation. But I just would like to highlight that United States has to pay attention to Latin America, because a lot of problems in all of those countries, and they have somehow to enhance cooperation with Latin America. Just I tell you funny stories that United States requires vaccine passports from all citizens of European Union to come to United States, but they do not require a vaccine passport from citizens coming from Latin America through the South. Just open door. So we are just joking. So Mexicans can go without passport. We have to have passport, and they postponed decision for several weeks. It was so big story. Yeah. It's confusing. A lot of such confusing decisions after pandemic. And one more point I would like to highlight: European Union never look into the some political leaders legacy or actions, because in European Union we now have 27 countries, and every month somewhere you have elections. So if you rely on elections on some political party, then it will be very difficult to manage. So usually European Union tend to rely on democratic system of the country, Congress or parliaments, and then they can elect leaders. And we understand that China and Russia moving forward, not by armed force, but mainly by installing own people into top positions. That's the biggest threat.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the potential effectiveness of the US containment policy, what's your view, Mr. Kim?
Well, I think America think at least that they could not maintain healthy international relations without solving China issue. Well, as you know, there is many problems caused by China. For example, some technology espionage, and also One Belt, One Road policy also make many noises in a third world, for example. So, and definitely someone who can say no about this situation is American himself, themselves think right this way. So I'm not so sure the AUKUS it has really some power to containment of China. But anyway, this is cannot be allowed continuously some movement of China in these reasons. And also, I think that Australia had wanted to very urgently lead this coalition with America, because Australia, she also had many pressure from China since a couple of years, especially dispute the COVID origin investigation dispute, and also some other issues like 5G, Huawei issues or something like that. So definitely, yeah, America should should play some important role against China. That is the first objective of America. Well, I'm not so sure how will this situation will be developed in near future, but I believe the Taiwan issue is one of the litmus paper. China also cannot be do not allowed any kinds of concession at all in these issues. They want maybe some control, complete control on China, on Taiwan, for example. But American also cannot concede continuously about in Taiwan issue. Well, Biden this Monday said America can admit some one China policy, even though he support autonomous Taiwan government. So, well, I don't know, but we will watch. We need to watch carefully what is the development of China at the Taiwan issue. Then we can find out what would be the next development between these two major countries. Yeah.
Yeah, great, thank you. So there's hardly ever a perfect policy in foreign affairs, right? So, but something needs to be done, it seems. So, Professor Kolodji, Ed, would you like to add to?
Yeah, I'll try to answer your question, which is, again, the United States seemingly are what allies of the moment contain the geopolitical power of China in the South China Sea, which claims, or more generally, globally. Our European colleague correctly points to the US and China like two sumo wrestlers, get away closer. They depend on each other so much that neither can achieve its welfare achievements, that is, welfare goals, to make China more prosperous, the United States also more stable economically, without some kind of an agreement, which at the moment does not exist in terms of rules of the road. At the same time, China, for its own Xi Jinping's leadership, rampant nationalism, remembrances of centuries of humiliation, all combined to pursue its power and control of the South China Sea in that general area. So you have a dilemma without a solution.
Right.
Economically, both states and all the trading states must continue to cooperate in the conditions of interdependence. One has to remember there is no global economic market system without the United States providing both the technological assistance and the markets under Deng Xiaoping, and the present cooperation that depends on American multilateral corporations producing goods in China. That economic relationship, however, is threatened by a geopolitical and more generally, a point that you made earlier, by an irreconcilable notion of legitimacy. There's no doubt that Xi Jinping has a clear idea that the CCP is essentially China.
Yeah.
And the CCP's control is tantamount to the existence and
Right.
prosperity of China. That you can't reconcile that with American liberal democratic views that cannot ignore human rights concerns as a function of their legitimacy as a liberal democratic state.
Right.
So at the risk of sounding pessimistic and gloomy, we are in really very dangerous waters because the Chinese will not at the moment under CCP rule relinquish the notion of parity militarily and of an aggressive position in the South China Sea with the Spratly Islands and the logistical capacities there, and the determination that they should control the air and water of the navigation through that area. That the one thing that limits that aggressiveness, but one doesn't know at what point that limit won't be breached, is the economic relationships between the two.
Right.
And hanging all over this, in order to increase the gloominess of all this, is an arms race all through the world, specifically in Asia, and an arms race that involves also nuclear weapons. Because
Right.
China has now announced it's going to be moving to about 1,000 warheads and a hypersonic capacity to visit nuclear weapons on the United States, namely a suicide pact between the United States and Europe. One doesn't know that an incident in the South China Sea or over Taiwan won't escalate beyond the capacity of the leaderships of all the countries involved to limit it. And yesterday's or the day before's talk between the two sides realizes they've got to at least lower the rhetoric.
Right.
Because the last thing you want is a nuclear war that is beyond their control. And if anyone has even a casual knowledge of what happened in World War I, nobody wanted a war and they got it, and we all know the consequences of it.
Yeah. Great. So I want to keep some time for our audience, but before we get there, I want to end just with one last question for our panelists here. So we don't really know whether or not the policy that surrounding AUKUS security pact will be effective, and to what extent is it going to be effective. But what AUKUS treaty does seem to signify is this 10-year-old, decade-long sort of US priority shifting towards Asia Pacific, right? And so with this pivot to Asia Pacific, by the way, it's not really just security in the security arena, right? We also had the Obama administration had a TPP, right? Pivoting to Asia. So with all this pivoting to Asia, what does that mean now for the relationship between the United States and the EU? And especially, what does it mean for the future of NATO?
Well, maybe I just answer. I wanted to highlight that that loss of a deal for France somehow should be repaid in economic means from other deals and economic agreements and so on. I hope that such type of solution will be in interest of Australia, USA, and UK in order to balance. They understand what does it mean to lose such big part of economy. The other point is that the competition is not only between countries or regions, or also about technology platforms. I think South Korea knows it very well. What does it mean when different technologies compete? But we have Apple, we have Samsung, we have Android. We managed to have several platforms. So I think that this in defense, it's highly it's becoming an issue, this technology, on which technology is based the equipment. So it's up to the companies to compete, and it's better to have several technologies and several platforms, not to monopolize. And third point about that, whole issue of relations in the region. Europe is, from my point of view, trying to encourage cooperation. That's clear. But for example, investment deal with China was stopped by the parliament because due to some concerns about different issues, let's say that way. And that means that it's not automatic that European Union will agree with United States or will follow United States or will do something like that. You have to understand that union of 27 countries with own governments, own political parties, own interests, and Europe is based on compromise. So the world should know that it's not Brussels who decides. 27 member states decide, and it's not so easy to reach compromise.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Thank you.
Well, I think fundamentally, even though there is some dissension between America and European countries, but there are traditional intimate relation and some important allies will continue in long term. But momentarily, there is some minor problems since the creation of AUKUS. And also, I believe in this condition, maybe the NATO's importance of NATO is relatively low, regarded relatively. Actually, maybe NATO will also function as an important military alliance in future, but in creation of AUKUS, in all these circumstances, NATO become more and more become political entity than military organizations in near future, because United States support NATO, but I believe that NATO can act as an important entity as in diplomatic and political role, for example, declare some important thing and pronounce some official statement, something like that. So it still has some power to contain or dissuade some hostile countries, but definitely it's a little bit difficult to, for example, send troops in real military battle, something like that. So it is maybe the NATO's main problem, I think, in near future. But at the same time, European countries, as I mentioned before, will try to find out some relatively independent their own military power. But as you know, there is a many lack of resources in European countries, and also, as you know, there is two major countries in Europe, so to speak, France and Germany. But unfortunately, very recently, these two countries also has a leadership change period. So, well, I don't know when it will be, but anyway, at least 1 year, in 1 year, 2 years, they could not have made some big difference. I think it's difficult a little bit, but I think also in the long term, the relations between Europe and America will be recovered definitely, even though currently there is some problem. And well, that's all.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ed.
Yeah, objectively, NATO should be the principal vehicle for American power to support European, all 27 plus Brexit, if you will. It is not doing that now. The pivot to Asia is more, for the Europeans, a rhetorical change. And it depreciates, and I think Mr. Kim is correct, the NATO as an effective deterrent has diminished its deterrent effect, partly because of the awkwardness and clumsiness and deliberate decision of moving to Asia without, in effect, maintaining its flank within Europe. If the Russian pressures on the states of Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, are to be any way deterred, America will have to increase its economic and military commitment. The presence of American troops is still helpful, despite the 12,000 that were drawn by the Trump administration. But the point of its diminished deterrent and effective geopolitical power is clear and unambiguous in Europe, in my mind, and also with respect to the degree of confidence because of the ANZUS Treaty and other things as well. The Trump administration is just treated NATO simply as a transactional relationship. You know, what have you done for us lately economically? Well, it was just an absurd position to take for the security of the United States or the European states. Well, I won't go on, but I do agree with Mr. Kim that the political and military power of Europe, of the United States vis-a-vis the European states, unfortunately has declined. And it has to be restated because the Russian pressure will continue. And it's only going to get worse, particularly as they've moved, that regime has moved from a, you might say, an authoritarian system to increasingly a dictatorial system. And that means more tension, more pressures to preserve the Russian regime's control will have an outward effect of pressuring the outside to justify its internal regime control. So it's really unfortunate where we are so far as American foreign policy is concerned towards Europe, or for that matter, towards Asia. One hopes that over time, I play basketball, okay? And you hope that the defense gives you something that is, not that you have any particular success yourself, but the errors of your adversary will possibly get you through these dilemmas of the moment.
Yeah. Right. There are lots of challenges. Perhaps we should open the floor and get some good suggestions and proposals from our audience. They have been very patient.
So I do see.
Let's open the floor.
I can read from the chat of some things that were already posted here.
Okay.
There's one comment. France and the EU have ignored the UK in their protests against the American-Australian change of front. I think rightly, the UK is totally a junior partner in this agreement. There's a comment there about some of the dynamics between the different parties involved. But then there's a further question right after it about a matter, and the panelists could consider commenting on these first, this comment that I already read, and then this next question either together or separately. But the question that comes after it is, to what extent may the Biden administration non-consultation with France and the EU be a reaction to the finalization of the EU-Chinese investment agreement without consultation with the incoming Biden administration in December 2020?
Well, our European colleagues should answer that because there is no deal yet at the moment, as I understand. There is no European Union investment deal with China. It's been held up.
No, it's hold on. Hold on.
Okay, and what are the terms of it?
Well, that's not the parliament rejected, didn't approve, and now it's under discussion what to do next. And also, European Union has a working group with the United States on investment agreement with China. So some coordination is going on, and maybe a common solution will be found. So that's the state of play, which I know maybe there are something behind the closed doors that I don't know, but officially it's under revision and discussion and in cooperation with United States, and maybe it will be some common result.
On this investment treaty, it's not enforced quite yet, is it? Countries still need to ratify it, right?
no. With China, no.
Okay.
So to clarify, it's my understanding that it might have been negotiated, but perhaps Dr. STARKEVIČÜÖTÄ could comment that the European Parliament refused to or blocked it in some way back in the spring. Is that correct?
Yes, and it's partly because ongoing, how to say, exchange of views with United States on the China investment agreement, because United States is preparing something like that. So it was postponed. Parliament didn't allow go through, and so now it's under, how to say, hanging on.
That's exactly what I thought. It's hanging on. It's not a done deal yet.
Right.
No,
Okay,
I don't think so.
Thank you for the
It's
clarification.
from I'm sorry, from the Commission, European Commission point of view, they had, because they prepared everything, and it's like working documents are ready, but you need political approval, and political approval is
I would
not
hope so.
in place.
I would hope so. I've
Still
never
in-
been a fan
no.
of the Commission. Thank you. Not from a democratic point of view.
This is not in place, still not. And I would like to point out that issue about this nuclear weapons and NATO and all this issue. In Lithuania, currently we have NATO battalion, United States battalion, and national army in order to protect us from, let's say, aggressive behavior of some of our neighbors. It's I mean Belarus and Russia. So they cooperate, train together, and that's not so bad. In real life, cooperation between different armed groups, or let's say organizations, are doing well, and there is a rotation every 6 months. So the mechanism is working. But of course, there are a lot of challenges that's necessary to improve it.
Well, I comment a little bit about United Kingdom. Well, I think that the United Kingdom is well, just after the Brexit, they want to some kinds of a new alliance, whatever it is, to other countries, and especially maybe UK want to reestablish a very close relations with United States and also have some all the time their power get again. They want to, I think so. And in this case of the AUKUS, joining to AUKUS and making some close relations between the Anglo-Saxon countries is a really good opportunity for them. And also maybe even not, it's a intervention directly to some important issue condition. Anyway, they can raise their own price when UK participated in this AUKUS system, I believe. So
Just 2 points. One, I think it's very encouraging that the US and Lithuanian troops and also Polish troops and the like cooperate. I don't think they're at a sufficiently level now to cope with the kind of pressures you get from Russia, but certainly those are positive. Just to add one more wrinkle to all our discussion, the United States, I think a case can be made, is the largest nuclear proliferator from any other state. There is no independent UK nuclear deterrent without US cooperation with respect to knowledge about warheads and the submarines. And it continues. And the last point is, we're not sure that the proliferation won't continue now flowing into Australia. Australia supposedly is not going to go nuclear except for its nuclear submarines, but one can't be fully certain that in the evolution of the proliferation problem, the Australians themselves might be tempted to move towards nuclear weapons themselves, simply under the conditions of continued pressure and arms, lack of arms control throughout the whole Asia. So the US in some ways has given more impulse to nuclear proliferation following a tradition that goes back to the Eisenhower administration, which first permitted US to share technical assistance with respect to nuclear weapons.
Great point.
There is actually a brief question in the chat that regards this last point, and that is someone was asking for clarification on what use are nuclear attack submarines to Australia anyway.
I think
Good
actually
point. First of all,
Professor
you're not even
Singer,
sure you're going to get some. It's going to take 10 years. Yeah, I'm sorry, I
Professor
didn't
Singer,
interrupt.
who
I
posed this question should be able to answer his own question. I think he's the expert on nuclear
No, no.
physics, right?
Yeah, I just want to say that I do not think that United Kingdom is a junior partner. I think that it's the biggest partner which changed the deal to from continental Europe to Anglo-Saxon Europe, because UK is anyhow member of Commonwealth, and Commonwealth is a big power so far, despite all changes and so on. And the second question, which is on in the charge with regards to probably investment deal with China, as I said, yes, Commission approved, but the deal is postponed. Implementation entering into the force due to the objection from the European Parliament, and that's now it's not working, not working.
Mhm. Yeah. On Professor Singer's question, so what use are nuclear attack submarines to Australia? So these submarines that the United States provide to Australia, these are nuclear fueled submarines, right? They're not nuclear weapon. They're not equipped with nuclear weapons. So how far is it to go from this technology to become a nuclear weapon state for Australia?
Well, I think whatever the level of the submarines capacity, anyway, Australia has a relatively low equipped, militarily low equipped country, and really not so enough resources to depend, for example, against China. Well, since a couple of years, Australia had really felt threatened by China, and they could be, whenever, could be a next target by China. I think they have felt right this way. So wherever the military buildup it is, they think it's not sufficient for them. So because of this, they made some coalition, some alliance with America. So I think, well, and also it not only the arms itself, the alliance itself has a very significant meaning to them. So because of that, they choose this one.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I agree with Mr. Kim that the larger point or impact of the submarine deal is the alliance, not the submarines.
Right.
The submarines will take 10 years, if then, to actually find themselves at sea. And it seems almost metaphorical that the submarines are really a kind of tribute to the perception, I think, of the Australians that they have now American power entering into Australian strategic thinking, and where the submarines are, if you will, the form of transfer, but not the physical transfer, because it'll take 10 years. And you're correct, what I read in the reports, they have a very low capability to actually absorb the nuclear technology. They only produce a handful of nuclear scientists each year. So that all has to be built up. And if it's not built up, then the UK and American technology will enter. And so there go the jobs that the Australians thought they would be getting, simply because they don't have the capacity to fulfill the contracts. But your larger point, I think, is well taken, that the importance of the submarine deal is more the commitments implied of support for Australian geopolitical interests, rather than necessarily that the submarines are going to be in the immediacy a response to military buildup by China.
That's a great point. So any other questions from audience? We all learned a great deal already. Right?
There is a comment about that brings New Zealand into the picture, and I don't know if our panelists would have any response to this, but it's a longer comment, so please bear with me. But among 5 alliance members, or so-called Anglo-Saxon-based alliance, New Zealand has been shown different perspectives on nuclear weapons and nuclear operations. New Zealand refused to allow nuclear-armed or nuclear-propelled US ships to call on its ports, and New Zealand Labour Party won a general election on a commitment to make New Zealand nuclear-free. Also, from an Australian point of view, the current relationship between China and Australia, it seems that their relationship won't be back on track soon, may affect the decision to join AUKUS or strengthen its relationship with their traditional allies. So there is also another, I guess, one point of this comment is that another country, in the region, New Zealand, that doesn't seem to figure in this discussion at all, perhaps with a different outlook and different approach to things.
This to me reads as a really larger question, right? So we have this trilateral security pact, but obviously the size of this pact, the area that it controls or covers is still evolving, right? So the question is still open. For instance, would France be entering this pact at some point, or perhaps it's not necessary for France to enter this pact, and because one key member in NATO on the European side, the UK is already sort of in the trilateral agreement. To me, the larger question is, how does this security pact evolve? Will it get bigger? Will it incorporate more countries? Then will it fundamentally, even more fundamentally shape the security architecture in Asia?
I think initially, again, from signals from Washington, it will absorb, almost by necessity, if not by agreement, Japan, South Korea, and increasingly India. And in fact, there is now the so-called Quad. And if there is any intelligence driving Washington's policy, it would be to strengthen those relationships from a security point of view of cooperation vis-a-vis China. So that would be, I think, one answer. Just to speak to New Zealand, I think it's important that they remain, ironically, nuclear-free. At least one voice, however small it might be, is a notion of caution to the nuclear powers in that area, including France, by the way, which is a nuclear power. And so I'm just thinking off the top of my head, I hope they become more vigorous in their demand for a nuclear-free zone in Asia, even if they don't get it. So that at least one voice is talking other than using military force to impose their positions on the other party. So 3.5 cheers for New Zealand.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great point. Okay, so it seems we don't really have any other questions from the audience. And we're also kind of running close to our time is pretty much up. So I guess I would just want to thank Professor Kolodji and Dr. STARKEVIČÜÖTÄ and Mr. Kim for joining us, discussing this really important case in global affairs. And I thank the audience for your patience and for your insights. Thank you very much.